14.01 FY 2018 proposed budget and CIP. I throw it to the far right here, Dr. Waltz.
Thank you, Chairman Sawyers and members of the school board. Tonight I'm going to give my usual budget speech, followed by Mr. Klein, who will go through the detail of the superintendent's proposed budget, which will eventually become the school board's budget. And since many months have passed since you've done this before, just as a reminder, tonight is the presentation of the budget. For those in the audience, the school board is seeing this for the first time. This is where the budget proposal is unveiled. Questions about the budget may be submitted by board members directly to Mr. Klein, and we have multiple budget work sessions. So tonight is actually not a night for questions, but there will be plenty of time for questions at subsequent meetings and school board work sessions. And again, you have the opportunity to submit them directly to Mr. Klein. So with that, I am pleased to propose a Prince William County Schools budget to serve the needs and aspirations of each of the nearly 91,000 students expected for the 2017-2018 school year. We are proud of our top-notch people, programs, and facilities that are essential to student success and continuous school improvement, but we continue to find ourselves constrained by limits on funding. By prioritizing needs and controlling costs, we offer a spending plan that maintains all existing educational programs and services, provides more than $26 million for the 2,420 students additional than were included in the 2016-2017 budget. It will boost employee pay of every employee by 2% to help attract and retain the best teachers and staff. It funds $8.9 million in increased debt payments on needed school construction and improvements, including the new non-traditional school at Independent Hill, covers costs to open the new elementary school at Potomac Shores, and the replacement for Kilby Elementary School, and invests an additional $8.4 million toward meeting urgent classroom, school, and division technology improvement needs. Balancing the budget was not easy. Anticipated funding from the Prince William County Board of Supervisors and the Commonwealth of Virginia, while higher than the year before, lagged behind the costs of added enrollment, inflation, and growing expectations. In total, new costs added to the budget exceed expected new revenue by approximately $11.4 million. Only careful planning and economizing let us fully balance spending with anticipated revenue. The result is a proposed 2017-2018 operating and debt service budget of $1.14 billion. This is not the budget of our dreams, however, it will fund student success. It also allows us to maintain, however, I must say this is not adding to, it is maintaining the incremental progress we've achieved toward addressing school board priorities such as class size reduction. It includes money for closing the achievement gap and doing our best to limit the use of educational trailers. With anticipated per pupil funding still among the lowest in the Washington, D.C. metro area, making bigger strides will be difficult. That is why, at the school board's direction, through the evaluation process, I have also provided, again at the board's direction, a supplemental plan for achieving much greater progress on strategic priorities over the next 5 years. This supplemental plan includes an expedited plan to further reduce class size, eliminate all trailers, close the achievement gaps, and estimates the necessary financial investments. I look forward to working with the school board to use this proposal and the supplemental document as starting points for moving us toward an approved budget. They will provide for student success and school improvement in the coming year while charting a course to build on that progress without undermining the foundations of our current successes. With school board guidance and help from all stakeholders who see investments in our students as a top priority, we can ensure a bright, world-class future for our children and all of the residents of Prince William County. At this time, Mr. Klein, Associate Superintendent of Finance and Support Services, will go through the detail of the proposed budget. Mr. Klein.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, Dr. Waltz. But before I start into the budget, I would like to take an opportunity very briefly here to certainly give thanks to a number of people as we've gone through the process. Certainly being the superintendent's proposed budget, Dr. Waltz has provided the leadership and guidance as we go through this entire process on an annual basis. We've had certainly support and assistance from the superintendent's staff. Within the budget staff, I certainly would like to express a very my appreciation to certainly Mr. John Wallingford and Ms. Kathleen Addison for the many days, nights, and weekends by which we have been sharing emails and updating the budget and getting it forward. And at the same time, there are many other departments that assist in the process, but notably Facilities Services, Information Technology Services, as we go through CIP and TIP, our communications and media folks as we put together the budget process. And I would be remiss if I did not mention my assistant, Mrs. Sherry Kleins, for her assistance probably in helping keep me sane. But thank you all very much. To start out, we'd like to certainly highlight what the budget process is and how that fits into Virginia law. As the superintendent indicated, this is the superintendent's proposed budget coming forward. It is in Virginia law defined as a document that comes from the superintendent to the school board and certainly is done in collaboration and an understanding of many of the needs and priorities that the school board would like to see. At this point, it comes forward to the board, then the school board then revises, approves, and eventually submits a budget to the county reflecting the needs of the school division. In turn, the Board of County Supervisors is responsible for funding the school division based upon the request for the school board, keeping in mind that the supervisors are responsible for setting tax rates, and the supervisors do not have line item authority over the budget. They can either budget it to us by a lump sum appropriation or by broad state categories. At times in talking to citizens, there is some confusion, and we simply like to remind them, the school board does not have taxing authority. While that might be the case in something like 90% of school divisions around the country, within the state of Virginia, that is not the case. Before I go into the detail, again, I'd like to just touch on some of the highlights of what we're going to see in this budget, and you can focus on the details as we go through it. Again, we're maintaining our current programs. We have seen a substantial growth in enrollment compared to the last several years. We're seeing this budget has to support 2,420 additional students, which is an increase of about 2.75%. I'll clarify this a little bit more as we go through. Reaching a total student enrollment next year is projected to be 90,636. This provides for a 2% pay plan adjustment per the school board's approved 5-year plan. Not what we necessarily want, but that meets that sort of the minimum standard that we've had in maintaining a balanced 5-year plan. We have a number of required state increases for Virginia retirement system, which we'll touch on. We are maintaining our class size reduction efforts. We're maintaining our capital improvements program, and we are also funding some improvements within the technology programs related to the student information management system and equipment for bandwidth enhancement. Now to the dollars and the revenue. This highlights the total budget for operating and debt service of just almost $1.14 billion, with an increase this year, which in many ways still seems somewhat huge, and it is. We're approaching almost $58 million. The operating fund grows by about 5%. The debt service fund, reflecting the mortgage and payment on construction of buildings and facilities, grows by just over 10%. Our county revenue is developed in accordance with our revenue sharing agreement. Our revenue from the state comes as a function. This is the second year of the biennium, and certainly it is built based on the governor's proposed budget. Keeping in mind the second year of the biennium from the state, they are typically funding us primarily for growth in student enrollment. All of the real funding and budget adjustments occur in the first year of each biennium, which would, in this case, be next year. Again, just to highlight a couple of things that were within the state, certainly the governor's proposed budget. There is no additional restoration of any reductions that the state's made in prior years. From a pay raise perspective, the state funds a 1.5% bonus effective as of December 1st of 2017. The state has also mandated an increase in an accelerated program for funding the Virginia retirement system, and those are our primary items. Our cost per pupil, just to keep it in perspective again, and this is within the Washington area boards of education using their format so that we have some form of apples to apples comparisons among the districts. Prince William County remains at the bottom of the chart again with a per pupil amount of $10,981. If we were to take a look at Loudoun County Public Schools for perspective, we're the second largest school division in the state. They are the third largest school division in the state with, I think, about 8,000 to 9,000 students fewer than us. If we were funded at the level of the Loudoun County Public Schools, we would have a budget that would be $193,961,000 higher. The operating budget for Loudoun County Schools is actually higher than our operating budget. As we look at cost per pupil over time, we'd also like to highlight that effectively, if we're looking at our adjusted for inflation of about 9,037, that actually goes back and is actually slightly less than what we were being funded on an inflation-adjusted basis back in 2006. Again, when we talk about county funding, and this is a chart that the county has used to highlight, the county provides just over 48% of our budget, not to be confused with the number in the revenue sharing agreement. But one of the elements that the county likes to highlight in this is, in fact, our overall tax burden in Prince William County is about 30% less than that of our neighbors to the north. If you go back to FY 2000, 2001, et cetera, the tax burden at that point was somewhat comparable. But certainly that in turn helps reflect why the per pupil funding that we receive from the county is substantially less. Just a reminder that from the state funding perspective, during the course of the Great Recessionary period, the state division, statewide, made a reduction of about $1.725 billion over the biennium. We certainly took our share of those cuts. The vast majority of those cuts have not been restored by the state. They have discussed and they've made some minor improvements. Again, being the second year of the biennium, these are not items that they would go into this year to look at addressing. From the funding perspective, one of the things that impacts us is not only the growth in student enrollment, but the students and the needs for the students that we have to fund. So certainly over a 5-year period, we've seen about an 8.9% growth in overall student enrollment. Our special education population has grown by 14.3%, which places an additional burden essentially on the budget. Our English language learners population, as we've indicated, has pretty much flattened out over the last 5 or 6 years. Now, it is still a substantial number. They're still growing, but essentially as a percentage of the total student population, it's flattened out. That generally helps the budget because at least it's not exceeding the pace of growth of total students. And finally, our free and reduced lunch population is still exceeding our growth in total students, but we'll note that the number last year over the previous 5-year period was just over 22%, so it has slowed somewhat. We'll see how that continues to change or evolve. In theory, we saw a very significant change here and nationwide in students that qualified for free and reduced lunch coming out of the Great Recession. One would think eventually as the economy continues that would catch up and it would start to balance out. Certainly we have not seen that yet. Another element I wanted to highlight is when we look at our percentage change of student enrollment, really going all the way back to 1991. But more importantly, if you go back to 2009, you'll notice in 2009 we had growth in enrollment of 4.1%, and we have steadily declined, and if I correct, the years at the bottom reflect September of that particular year. So September 16 on the far right reflects this past fall and would be relevant to fiscal year 2017. But one of the impacts we've had in the budget for no, really the past 7 years, is we have seen we've continued to grow. The pace of that growth has slowed, which in turn has made it easier to balance the budgets in those years that we've been going through. Unfortunately, as we go into this year, we really kind of get a double whammy. One is we see our student growth and enrollment goes up by 1.9% simply in the sense of new projections. That's just over 1,700 additional students. However, if you recall, this past fall, we also picked up 704 students above projection in the current year. So we are actually, that's where we get to having to fund 2,420 additional students when we go budget to budget. Again, from enrollment trend, we tend to keep growing. We're projecting an enrollment growth of 90,636 next year. And again, as we go addressing our budgetary needs, I attempt to highlight here the fact that the biggest issue we deal with certainly in the budget is for every 24 students that walk in the door, one way or another, we have to provide a teacher, we have to provide a classroom, and we have to provide the appropriate and associated services that go along with that. The slide here is simply an effort to help highlight what some of those costs and those services are. It's there for your and the public's information. As we get into the proposed budget itself, starting with the 2017 approved budget, which was just over $1 billion for operating and debt service, we have a number of baseline adjustments that are made essentially as we shift from one budget into the next. The most significant items within baseline adjustments would be we eliminate one-time costs, but the biggest one generally is they shift in the changes in salaries as we go from budgeting for salaries in one year to recognition of those actual salaries as we go into the succeeding year. If you recall last year, between budgetary actions to kind of reduce our holdback allocation, plus, if you recall last spring, as we went into the approved budget, we had identified a substantial growth. We saw that growth in enrollment coming. We raised the concern we might be seeing it. In the spring, we had certainly seen it as an increase in a number of ELL students. We did, in fact, recognize that additional growth. We funded a good part of it in the approved budget, and obviously even more in the fall. As we go into this budget, we have to restore those funding amounts for the holdback allocation. And again, its primary purpose is, as we go into the fall, to ensure that we have additional funding to address what we would normally see as growth in student enrollment. Obviously, this past year, we've seen a rate substantially higher than that. The proposed budget does not include an inflation factor for supplies, materials, and equipment. And within the context of the budget, there are a number of federal, state, and local grants and self-supporting programs. Revenue comes in for those particular areas. This identifies $3 million that's associated with that revenue that then is dedicated to supporting those specific programs. Within compensation, this budget does not provide for a step increase. It does provide for a 2% pay plan adjustment, effectively a COLA, which would be 2% for across the salary scale for employees. And that, again, is consistent with the plan, if you will, that is included within our approved 5-year plan. There would be slippage in compensation associated with that, which essentially means due to turnover of staff, vacancy rates, et cetera, we can reduce some of those costs, acknowledging that we will recoup some of that cost as we move forward, to the tune of just about $7.5 million. Our Virginia retirement system, our costs go up by $9.5 million. If you'll recall, in the governor's budget and General Assembly last year, they had accelerated the rate for the Virginia retirement system to reach a level of 100% funding to basically get the total pension liability back on track for the Virginia retirement system. They've accelerated that, and our cost share for this year is $9.5 million. In doing so, our rate goes up by 1.66 points, which amounts to about an 11.4% increase in the rate for Virginia retirement system. The good news in one sense is this gets us up to what would be considered the normalized or 100% rate. We may see rate changes in the future, but they're really a function of normal actuarial changes for experience in the economy and that type of thing. We would be out of the catch-up mode. However, this year, we have to pay the bill. The other one is that our health insurance, and I'll come back to another slide in more detail later, we are projecting a 1% increase in our health insurance rates for employees, and we think that is a very positive item going forward into this budget. Additional changes, obviously the biggest one out there is certainly with 2,420 additional students, the cost of maintaining programs and services for those students is $26.4 million. So when you kind of look at this budget as opposed to last year's budget, one of the substantial differences is we have, and I don't remember the exact number, we're putting about another $10 million into simply growth in paying for the growth in student enrollment to maintain programs that we didn't have last year. We make adjustments for funding of startup costs for Potomac Shores, take out the initial startup costs, put in the fixed allocation to start the school, and we would proceed forward. We participate with Thomas Jefferson High School as a governor's school. One of the components of that was we picked up as a part of that process, we paid for part of the renovation of that building. There was a 4-year schedule to adopt a payment. This recognizes the additional $31,000, and this is the 4th year of the 4 that puts us at the point that we are fully paying for that sort of our share of that building renovation, and that is to the extent that we are sending students to that school, we are actually helping pay for part of the facility cost of that school. And finally, as I previously indicated, our debt service, our net adjustment, our net increase in cost is $8.9 million. As we've moved forward in our approved 5-year plan, we have, for the last several years, we would continue the process by which we increase recurring funding for our technology improvements program by $500,000, and we would intend to continue doing that in the succeeding years. As we look at new resources, and again, this is substantially different from last year, again, a function of both simply what we have in revenues and what the sort of our fixed costs have already required those expenditures to be. The first 4 items amount to, we have a nursing coordinator, half a performing arts teacher at Colgan as a function of the support for the Specialty School for Fine and Performing Arts. We continued with a program we started last year. This is the 2nd year of some additional programmatic funding for Osborne Park to facilitate their programs as part of the pre-governor school. We funded part of it last year. This provides the 2nd component to that. And 0.6 of an FTE for a division-wide student activities director. Those are the sort of the personnel costs or the sort of true recurring costs that are within this budget, amounting to 1.6 FTE and just over $240,000. The big items, if you will, that are within new resources, one is that the board had directed the superintendent move forward with a review of the special education program, and this provides funding to meet that requirement. In addition, we've certainly identified the need for the last several years that our student information management system is effectively reaching its end of life. The vendor will no longer be supporting it. As a result, we had planned for, and last year we started this process of setting aside some money. This would then fund not necessarily all of it at this point, but $6.4 million towards the replacement of that system, keeping in mind again that this is a one-time cost. So while it is funded in this year's budget, it's not an item that continues over into next year's budget. Likewise, one of the items that certainly has been identified is concern over increasing network bandwidth. This part of the budget would facilitate funding to buy the equipment necessary to help support the increase in bandwidth. You have to get the equipment in before you can buy the service. At some point in the future, whether it's in the next year or in the following budget, we would then need to come back and essentially identify funding to support the fee you would pay to obtain the actual service of the bandwidth. Coming back to look at balancing the budget, as you'll recall, last year we opened the division-wide aquatic center. The aquatic center is up and running. It is in the process that it is Working as an enterprise fund, it generates revenue. We certainly expected in its first year of operation, the current year, that it would require funding because, for example, we had an aquatics manager on staff starting in July. The pool didn't even open until September. We are moving successfully at operating the pool. This would reduce the transfer to the division-wide aquatic center by $100,000. And finally, essentially the balancing mechanism is, as a part of our budget, annually we fund new construction projects and renewal projects from a variety of means, both debt service and cash. This essentially takes just over $11 million in projects that may previously have been funded as a function of cash. We are still funding cash projects, and shifts it to debt finance the budget, to this portion of the budget or that portion of the CIP. And this in turn balances our expenditures and our revenues with a total of $1,137,444,458, and again balances the budget. As we look at the capital improvements program, and certainly the school board had a work session back in January, and much of that detail then is available, but to hit some of the highlights, the capital improvements program would look at a relocation from the current Ann Ludwig facility, which is certainly we're going to need to do something relative to that facility relative to repairing and upgrading it. This would make a relocation of the staff and facilities there to other locations, continue those services, and that's been added in 18. In addition to Minnieville Elementary School in 19, adding what was previously an elementary school in the Stonewall/Yorkshire area is Yorkshire area in 22, and adding another one in the Stonewall area in 24. Likewise, also adding an elementary school to the Occoquan Woodbridge area in 2024. We have previously had a 13th and 14th high school identified in our CIP. Our enrollment numbers still continue to climb. While we had 704 additional students this past year in the fall, we actually had 777 additional high school students above and beyond what we had projected. So we are still seeing pressures in that sense, which help justify the need for a 15th high school. We have currently put that into the CIP in 2025. The exact year, that could potentially slip back further. It would really depend on what's happening with our student enrollment numbers as we proceed probably through the next 2 or 3 years. But again, from our total number of students relative to this total capacity around the county, we see the need for an additional, for the 15th high school. And therefore, we also will have to look at acquiring a site for that high school with a plan for that in 2019. We would also be looking at adding and considering middle school music rooms as we do our middle school renewal programs, looking at an addition or renewal to the Kelly Leadership Center out in 2027. It seems amazing to me that this building is actually in its 9th year of operation, and at some point now going out another 10 years is what it amounts to. We are likely to have to look at addressing potential space implications and updates for this facility. There are several items that were removed from the CIP. The previous CIP had an elementary school at 2024 in Van Hill area. That one is currently out of the CIP. We also had an addition for an elementary school in the Haymarket area that we talked to you about last year. That has also been taken out of the CIP. And finally, as I've mentioned before, the CIP within the technology area, we would include technology enhancements of replacing the student information management system, which we would go out to bid next year and move forward toward awarding a contract to replace that, and again, equipment to support increases in network bandwidth. A brief summary then of what is in the 5-year capital improvements program. And again, we're seeing growth of almost 8,500 students in that time period. This provides for 6 new, I won't go through all the details, 6 new school facilities, 93 additional classroom additions, 3 support facility improvements, and again, we'd be looking at a current student capacity of over 87,000. This would increase our capacity by about 8,400 students, but keeping in mind that at this point in time, we still have 211 portable classrooms. Each year as we go through the process, once we sit down with the budget, we also have to turn around and take a look at the 5-year plan. And doing that, we take a look at what are the costs for current programs and services, what is our growth in new students, what are the additional costs to maintain and continue those programmatic and instructional programs we have for students, repairs and renewals, which would include CIP, including the costs for new schools, and balancing that off against what our projected revenues are. Again, I would certainly like to make the reminder that the 5-year plan does not mean it's zero in every year. We have a fiscal obligation. The fact that the 5-year plan is balanced does not mean that the needs of the school division are being met, simply that the school board will balance the budget as required by law. In order to briefly touch on that 5-year plan, these are the basic assumptions that are contained within that plan. Again, it's based on an increase of about 3.5% in revenue from the county per their revenue plan last year. It has alternating years for pay plan adjustments, as we indicated, 2% in 18, the year we're going into. It would also be in 20 and 22, with step increases in 2019 and 2021. This pattern of adjustments has also been a pattern that is essentially reflected on the county side as they go through their budget process. We're not exactly the same each year, but again, we have typically been trying to follow a comparable pattern of pay increases alternating between step increases and pay plan adjustments. For plan purposes, we budget for health insurance going up by 5% a year. And again, for Virginia Retirement System, the good news is we've reached a point at which those rates now go to fully funded. We will, that will take some of the pressure off future budgets, and we will simply have to look at how that is adjusted relative to the actuarial changes for the pension fund. We continue our capital improvements program. We do have a balancing mechanism in some years of utilizing bond funding for cash-funded projects. It goes up and down in various years, and over time it certainly changes as we move from one year to another and our costs and revenues adjust. Again, a reminder that this does not, in this budget process, does not eliminate trailers. We currently have 211 of them, nor does it address approximately $200 million in other needs that have been identified within the budget. The following slide, as we've talked somewhat about debt service, and debt service is really we sell school bonds, we build schools. This is the mortgage. Our mortgage payment this year is roughly $97.2 million. Over time, we're seeing about a 5.4% annual growth rate in that mortgage. This particular year, it is a 10.1% increase. Again, that's a function of the debt that we've issued really the last couple years and this year as that comes due. We also have a requirement under the county principles of sound financial management to try and ensure that our debt service payments do not exceed 10% of our annual revenues. And certainly the cap, if you will, on that, to the extent that annual revenues go up, the cap on that goes up and you have additional debt capacity as well. We've highlighted again that this provides basically an overview of health insurance rates since 2007. The national rate for growth in health insurance on average has been running about 9 to 10%. We as a division have actually done much better with our self-insured fund and have been at an average about 5%. This year, in a sense, we are pleased that the increase for coming into the next year is 1%. We think we're doing well. We will continue to do that. A reminder that really the real components of what drives our costs for health insurance are really only two things. We are self-insured. We contract services, we pay the bills. Two things drive those costs: utilization of health insurance by our employees and the rate of medical inflation. Those are basically the two items that drive our costs. Overall, we think we're running a well-managed program, and our costs have reflected that as well. In summary, certainly the school board develops, again, and this is sort of a reminder as much to the public, we develop and put forward a budget that is within the funding constraints that are provided. The county and the state are our two biggest sources of funds, totaling about 96% of our total budget. We seek to meet the needs of our students with programs and services to provide a quality education We will recognize that there are many areas that we don't think we are necessarily meeting all those needs, but certainly we're meeting our fiscal obligation. And we have needs certainly in class size reduction, overcrowding, permanent building space, competitive salary and benefits, restoring of previous cuts, and certainly improving instructional programs. As we've indicated from the superintendent, we are giving our students a great start. What we invest in their journey may help determine how far many can go. As we move through this budget process, this reflects the budget timeline. Again, tonight is the first time the budget is presented and put out by the superintendent. It's the first time the board sees it. And at the same time, there's sort of an understanding the superintendent cannot provide the budget to the board without providing it to the public at the same time. Again, the intention is not to take any action on this budget tonight. Just to remind people, this is the beginning of a process that takes place over about 2 months. This provides the schedule by which we have a public meeting next Monday, work sessions through the month of February into March, a markup, a final approval. We go to the Board of County Supervisors to present the school board, once the school board adopts a budget, present that budget to the Board of County Supervisors on March the 28th. They are currently scheduled for adoption of a budget in April the 18th. But wait, there's more. While we've provided a budget and meeting our obligations, certainly with the revenue sharing agreement, the superintendent has moved forward that proposed budget. At the same time, the school board has directed the superintendent to develop and propose supplemental budget to help identify additional needs that exist above and beyond those funding issues that we've identified and addressed within the context of the proposed budget. As we move forward, I will touch on 4 basic areas that fulfill the elements of essentially a supplemental request, that being class size reduction and the discussion of an expedited 5-year plan, costs associated with the potential elimination of trailers, additional items relative to closing the achievement gap, and sort of compliance, other budget priorities. I'll go through these one at a time. Again, this is a function of a directive from the school board to the superintendent to bring forward a plan to look at the supplemental budget needs of the school division so that we can bring that to the attention of both the supervisors and the general public. As we go through this plan, we'd like to highlight a couple of components. While we could certainly sit down and throw some really huge numbers out there, and there are some really huge numbers out there, we've attempted to do this in I think, a fiscally responsible manner to say it's not just a wish list. We've looked and said, let's go back and say, the Great Recession came right after 2007, and rather than just saying, let's just arbitrarily pick a number of what do we want to have in our classrooms, what do we might want to have, and in many cases, what might best practices be, this essentially takes us back and saying, let's look at what we were funding, the programs we were funding, the staffing ratios, et cetera, as recently as 2007, and look at what it takes to get back to that level. I confess that about 10 years ago, I stood up here and said, we're going in the Great Recession, and I'm afraid it's going to take us 10 years to get out of it. I was wrong. 10 years is right upon us, and we are nowhere close, unfortunately. This plan does not include restoring many of the school and central office reductions. It does not attempt to go back and restore pay scales and benefits that one can argue were not comparable in that time period to what was provided in previous periods. This sort of summarizes it once again, and many of the things that we've had to do during the Great Recession, we had significant revenue reductions from both the county and the state. They were addressed by making a variety of budget cuts, including class sizes and teachers. We took reductions across the entire budget. This is a plan to look at going back and seeing how we can install effectively the instructional components of many of those reductions. The next several slides start to walk through sort of many of the components that say to get back to that level of fiscal year 2007, what would these items be? Now, again, keeping in mind that If I take a look at many of the numbers, we'll see some really big numbers, but in order to provide a realistic plan, this really looks, in this slide I'll identify, we have some funding numbers relative to a column for fiscal year 2018 to identify some specifics, but keeping in mind that the total need out there, this is what it would take to go back to really the 2007 level. So this was much more, again, of an incremental approach, because I think, to be realistic, it's not going to happen overnight. There are areas within this budget and within this plan that I would like to highlight. Certainly the first two items there, while we refer to economically disadvantaged and at risk, the greatest correlation there is with student performance is economic status. So as a function of that, we have historically and continually for the last almost 30 years, provided funding to schools to help, based on the number of students that are considered economically disadvantaged, to provide funding to those schools. Essentially, this is a mechanism for providing additional funding for at-risk students. It can also be seen as funding that's provided for helping close the achievement gap in our schools. This is the only monies, and there are monies in the regular budget, this is in addition to what we currently have, that go towards these areas. These are the only monies in the budget for which there's really not a programmatic requirement. The school looks at what their needs are, they look at their achievement gaps, they look at their school performance, and this is one of the few areas in which, on a school-by-school basis, looking at their own students, they have an opportunity to look at how they can best address the needs of their students in that school. This plan calls for essentially another $1 million at K-5, almost $700,000 at 612. Obviously, the greater need is almost $12 million. If you converted that to people, because I'm not saying it's all going to be people necessarily, that actually reaches almost 130 teaching positions. Or another way to put it is, there are 130 fewer teaching positions today in our system than there would be if we were using the same funding mechanisms that we had in 2007. Other areas are certainly within special education for specific learning disability, one of our achievement areas. Again, emotional disabilities program, English language learners. And there are still, we have pretty much caught up to 2007 relative to K-3. I think particularly for grades 1 through 3, we have actually managed to restore back to the 2007 levels. At grades 4 and 5, that's a function of eventually reducing the cap in class sizes further. That's essentially another 9 positions division-wide. For the total plan, this would provide partial funding in fiscal year 2018. As we continue, similarly, we made reductions in middle school. This would provide for additional funding for middle school, special education, again, in speech and language impaired, visually handicapped, hearing impaired, regular high school student instruction again, diagnosticians, occupational therapy, physical therapy, adapted PE, and while gifted education is there at the moment, it is not an additional component in 18. It would be being addressed as we continue through the total need and in the out years of the plan. For perspective, again, this request, if you will, continues to the tune of approximately $6.5 million in fiscal year 2018. And one of the components we certainly have to look at is if it is the tie also between changing the programs, restoring the programs, and space. If we went back and said if somebody gave us the opportunity to give us $37.5 million and had the opportunity to hire 450 more staff members, we would not have a place to put them. We would certainly do our best to try. But it would create a space issue. As a means of going through this, again, and I'd like to make another highlight that while we have essentially 452 fewer positions today relative to 2007, at the same time, keep in mind, we are attempting to achieve higher standards of student performance since then in an increasingly regulated educational environment while addressing greater diversity with students facing increased social dynamics. It's a much tougher world than it was 10 years ago, and we're still trying to move forward. Again, this does not include any potential associated support costs or central office costs relative to students and staff. So if we turn around and look at the next component, that essentially becomes space. And these involve everything from site acquisition to new elementary, middle, and high schools. The issue in FY18 is, again, when you're looking at the construction of facilities, it doesn't happen overnight. Therefore, within the context of 18, we have elements of school site acquisition, school construction, going forward in our CIP. For 18, please look at the CIP and you can see those specific components. In order to address the space needs driven by the additional, and this looks at the total numbers of restoring back to 2007, this generates a need for an additional almost just over $277 million. How does that occur in a sense? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, I previously highlighted middle school teachers. We identified a total need essentially where we had of restoring 91.82, well, let's just say almost 92 teachers. But a middle school contains 76 classrooms. If we added 92 additional regular middle school teachers, effectively it identifies in some way, shape, or form the need for 1.2 additional middle schools. At the high school level, that would generate 107 additional high school teachers. A general high school currently contains about 101 classrooms. Hence, that's where we'd be looking at this and saying we need two additional elementary schools, an additional middle school, and an additional high school in the long term. The second component of the supplemental budget request would be taking a look at the elimination of portable classrooms. Again, there are 211 portable classrooms. Looking at the distribution of our students in portable classrooms, trying to take into account how we are proceeding in the current 5-year plan, because the current 5-year plan is not eliminating trailers per se. We have, since Dr. Waltz came here, I think we have reduced the number of trailers about 25, I think. We've made some minor progress, but obviously we're still sitting with a substantial number of trailers, 211 division-wide. To eliminate them is a cost of about $307 million. And again, I've identified needs for site acquisition and specific schools to try and accomplish that. As a third component, and while that's identified as closing the achievement gap, I really need to highlight something right off the bat. Keep in mind that closing the achievement gap covers many areas in the budget. These are several additional items. When I talked earlier about the expedited 5-year plan, many of those items in the expedited 5-year plan, economically disadvantaged, the changes in ratios for special education, are all elements towards closing the achievement gap. I don't want the perception that we can fix the achievement gap by funding $4.5 million. That is not the case. Again, these are addition, and the ones that are specifically identified here reflect a director of school improvement, additional instructional coaches, that is staff development for our teachers, and additional teaching positions within special education regarding specific learning disability. Between the first portion of the expedited 5-year plan and the closing the achievement gap, that effectively adds approximately 60 positions within specific learning disability. And as we reach near a conclusion, looking at some other needs and additional priorities that we know exist within our school division, we've identified within the proposed budget, we identified the equipment needs for increasing a network bandwidth. And certainly there's a need to go from what I think our current gigabyte needing to go to 10. It is a substantial need going forward. Once that equipment and the hardware is in place, it's like paying for cable. You can get the cable in place, but then you got to pay the cable fees. Well, our fee for increasing that service is $720,000. As a function of our administrative management systems, we have a need for an applicant tracking, evaluation, and record system. Much of this is done in a very manual process today, and we certainly have a tremendous need to move forward with a significant improvement in that area. We also have a needs to improve our records retention systems, particularly I think some elements of email. The federal government has imposed, we always call them unfunded mandates, but storm sewer environmental standards continue to tighten up year by year. we have some additional requirements in that area. It becomes increasingly difficult to track what those changes are and ensure that we're in compliance. Obviously, on a day-to-day basis, we will continue to do our best. We really need more resources to help pursue that. Likewise, on our website accessibility, we need additional support. And the final item in this is the school board. A number of school board members had requested from the superintendent that there be additional staffing that the Board of County Supervisors certainly have. I believe they have an office and 3 staff members essentially for each member. And I'll go to the next slide. This essentially takes forward a proposal that would provide for essentially one secretary for each of the school board members. It does not specifically provide for any office space, and then it would also include monies necessary to the operation of an office. We would still have to look at how we would provide sort of office space. And a final item as we go into this budget, as we recall from Chairman Sawyer's remarks from January the 18th, and I can be happy to quote it, I guess. Pretty sure our quote's right. Would you like to read? I'm not good at impressions. I'm the finance guy. So the money, more of those budget cuts. The money has been allocated to the school board. If you take out the situation as it existed over the last few weeks, had that money been appropriated to the school board, we would have then handled that money through the normal budget process. Or if it was an addendum to the budget, the superintendent and his staff would bring us an addendum and say, here's how they planned on spending it. The superintendent has then added a recommendation to respond in that sense to the chairman's request with an identification for the $10.675 million as to land acquisition on the east and the $10.675 million expressed as debt service towards the 13th high school plan with the additional 500 seats. Again, as we get to the end of the process here this evening, just a couple of reminders. Again, process-wise, this is the superintendent's proposed budget required by law for him to provide to the school board. At this point, the budget process transitions to the school board budget process. We have provided the proposed budget, and per the school board directive, have provided the supplemental budget information. Historically, the school board has not engaged in an extensive or question and answer session at this point because, like the public, you have just received the information. Much of it can be overwhelming. We have significant time to go through the budget process. From that, we will have work sessions. Eventually, we'll come back and vote. Certainly, along that lines, if you could call me, email me, send me your questions and concerns, and we will endeavor to get those answers and turn it around so that we can provide answers to all of the board relative to the questions that each of the school board members have. With that, thank you very much.